The summer sun was shining brightly over London, and the streets near Buckingham Palace were full of life. Families, couples, and groups of tourists from all over the world gathered in front of the palace gates. The scene was alive with laughter, chatter, and the clicking of cameras. Children pointed toward the tall men in red coats and tall black bearskin hats who stood so perfectly still that some people wondered if they were even real. For many tourists, seeing the royal guards was one of the highlights of their trip. They represented tradition, history, and discipline in a way that fascinated both young and old. Among the crowd was a young tourist named Daniel. He had flown in from another country for his first trip to London. Daniel loved taking photos and sharing them with his friends online. To him, this wasn't just a vacation. It was an adventure he wanted to capture from every angle. As he stood among the other travelers, he kept staring at the guards with wide eyes. Their motionless posture amazed him, and he couldn't stop thinking about how they managed to stand there in the heat without moving an inch. He whispered to his friend that it must be one of the hardest jobs in the world, but at the same time it looked almost unreal. Daniel had read before that the royal guards were famous for their discipline. He knew they weren't just people in costumes. They were real soldiers with strict responsibilities, but curiosity began to grow inside him. He wanted to see what would happen if he got just a little closer. The ropes and barriers were clear, and signs had been placed everywhere warning visitors not to cross. But Daniel told himself it was probably fine if he leaned in just a little. After all, he thought it would only take a second to get a picture. As the minutes passed, Daniel felt his excitement building. Tourists all around were trying to get the best photographs. Some zoomed in with their cameras, while others stretched their phones high above their heads to capture the guards behind the crowd. Daniel, however, wasn't satisfied with a picture from far away. He wanted something different, something he could post that would make his friends back home say, "Wow, you really stood that close to a royal guard?" He imagined the comments, the likes, and the attention it would bring. His thoughts drifted, and for a moment he forgot about the seriousness of the guard's role. He glanced around at the people nearby. Parents were busy keeping their children in line, couples were taking selfies with the palace in the background, and tour guides were explaining the history of the monarchy. Nobody seemed to notice Daniel's restlessness. He shifted on his feet, stepped forward a little, and found himself just behind the rope. The guard in front of him didn't move a muscle. His eyes were straight ahead, his hands firm on his weapon. To Daniel, it felt like a silent challenge. The guard's stillness seemed to whisper, "How close are you willing to come?" Daniel laughed nervously and looked back at his friend, who shook his head as if to warn him not to do anything foolish. But Daniel wasn't easily discouraged. The thought of having a close-up photo with one of the guards was now stuck in his mind. He convinced himself that everyone exaggerated the rules. He thought, "They're just standing there. It's only a picture. Nobody will care if I step a little closer." His heart began to beat faster, half from excitement, half from nerves. The air around him seemed to shift. A few people in the crowd noticed how close Daniel was standing to the rope. Some raised their eyebrows. One mother whispered to her child to watch carefully, as she had a feeling something might happen. The atmosphere was changing, slowly becoming more intense, though most tourists were still too busy with their own cameras to pay attention. Daniel wiped his forehead, feeling the warmth of the sun and the weight of the moment. He was standing at the edge of a decision. On one side, there was safety, respect, and staying where everyone else stood. On the other, there was the thrill of breaking the invisible wall that separated ordinary people from the royal guards. His curiosity was winning, step by step, thought by thought. The longer he stared at the guard, the stronger the urge became. It wasn't about disrespect. Daniel didn't mean any harm. To him, it was simply about testing limits. But he didn't fully understand the importance of the guard's role, or the consequences that might come from ignoring the boundaries. He believed that nothing serious would happen. At most, maybe a polite warning, or perhaps even no reaction at all. After all, he had seen funny videos online of people trying to joke with guards. But reality was often far different than the internet made it seem. He slowly raised his phone, pretending he was just adjusting the camera. His friend tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Don't, you'll regret it." Daniel gave a small smile but shook his arm free. He thought his friend was just being overly cautious. The rope was now only a step behind him, and the guard, unmoving as ever, stood like a statue carved from stone. The palace behind them glowed in the sunlight, the golden details shining against the deep blue sky. It was the perfect background, the perfect shot. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. His heart raced, his palms sweated, and he wondered if this was really the right thing to do. But the thought of going home without the photo he dreamed of pushed him forward. Tourists nearby sensed his hesitation and began to whisper. A few pulled out their phones, curious to see if this stranger would dare to break the rule. The crowd, without realizing it, had become an audience waiting for the first move. The city noises seemed to fade. The sound of cars on the nearby street, the chatter of people, even the cries of children. It all felt quieter as Daniel stood there, ready to take a step. His mind was full of images, the laughter of his friends, the thrill of telling the story, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, the guard would remain still, and nothing dramatic would happen. But deep inside, there was also a voice, faint but steady, reminding him that some lines exist for a reason. Some traditions are not meant to be tested. He ignored that voice. The rope was just a symbol, and to him, symbols could be crossed. The only thing left was action. As he inhaled deeply and prepared himself, the crowd held its breath. What would happen next? Nobody knew, but in that instant, everyone sensed they were about to witness something unforgettable. Daniel's heart was beating fast as he took the step that crossed the rope barrier. It was only one step, but it felt like a giant leap into a world he wasn't supposed to enter. The crowd noticed it instantly. Gasps spread among those closest to him, and even the people who had been busy with their cameras turned their heads. The moment his foot touched the forbidden space, the atmosphere around the palace gates changed. The cheerful chatter quieted, replaced by whispers and nervous laughter. Daniel didn't hear most of it. His mind was focused only on the guard standing in front of him. The man in the red uniform did not flinch. He stood tall, his face calm and unreadable, his eyes fixed forward. He looked as though Daniel did not exist at all. That only made Daniel's curiosity stronger. He raised his phone slowly, holding it at arm's length. His hand trembled a little, not just from nerves, but also from the excitement of being so close. The guard's black bearskin hat looked even taller up close, and the golden details on his uniform shone brilliantly under the sun. Daniel thought it was the perfect photo, one that would make his friends say he had done something bold and daring. The crowd behind the rope was no longer just watching the palace. They were watching him. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking in a hushed voice, "Mom, is he allowed to do that?" The mother shook her head firmly, her eyes glued on the young man who was now standing closer to the guard than anyone else dared to go. Some tourists pulled out their own phones, ready to record what they sensed might become a dramatic moment. Daniel's friend, still standing safely behind the rope, whispered urgently, "Daniel, stop, this isn't a game." But Daniel only gave a small laugh, trying to hide the fact that his stomach was twisting with nerves. He thought, it's just for one picture. One quick moment, and then I'll step back. As he leaned in slightly, holding his phone higher, a few people in the crowd started murmuring. They knew what Daniel didn't fully understand, that the royal guards were trained not only to stand still, but also to protect their post with discipline and seriousness. The rope wasn't there just for decoration. It was a boundary that carried history, respect, and law. The guard remained silent, but the silence itself felt heavy. It was the kind of silence that warned without speaking. Daniel tried to smile for the selfie, but his smile came out shaky. He wondered if the guard could see him from the corner of his eye. He wondered if the guard was waiting for the right moment to react. The more he thought about it, the more his hands began to sweat. For the people watching, every second seemed longer than the last. The still figure of the guard and the bold presence of the tourist created a tension that nobody could ignore. One man in the crowd whispered to his wife, "He's about to regret this," while another shook his head and muttered, "Why do people always have to push the rules?" Daniel held his breath and clicked the camera button. The sound of the shutter was quiet, but in that moment it echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. He lowered the phone, glancing at the screen to check the picture. For a second he felt a rush of victory. He had done it. He had crossed the line, stood close, and captured the shot. But then something happened. The guard's boot suddenly stomped against the ground with a sharp, thunderous sound that shook the air. The noise startled Daniel so much that he nearly dropped his phone. The crowd gasped loudly, some stepping back instinctively. The calm, silent guard had broken the stillness, and the sound of his stomp carried a message of authority. Daniel froze, his eyes wide. The guard's body shifted slightly, his hand tightening on the rifle, his posture firm and commanding. For the first time, Daniel understood that this was no game. He felt a wave of heat rush through his body as fear replaced his excitement. He stood rooted to the spot, unsure whether to apologize, move back, or simply stay still. The crowd was now whispering louder. Some had their cameras pointed straight at him, recording every moment. A little boy covered his ears, startled by the loud stomp, while his father said in a low voice, "That's why you never cross the line. They don't joke." Daniel glanced at the guard again. The man's face was unreadable, but his presence was powerful. It was as if every inch of him declared, "You do not belong here. Step back." The silence that followed the stomp was heavier than before, filled with tension. Daniel realized that the guard had not shouted yet, but he could feel the warning in the air. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. His friend behind the rope was waving frantically, signaling him to return. Daniel looked down at the photo on his phone, and suddenly it didn't feel so important anymore. What had seemed like a harmless idea now felt reckless. He realized that this was more than just about breaking a rule. It was about respect, and he had crossed a line not just physically, but symbolically. Still, part of him hesitated. The crowd's attention was on him, and he felt the weight of their eyes. He wondered what they were thinking. Were they laughing at his boldness or judging him for his disrespect? The answer was probably both. He wanted to prove he wasn't afraid, but deep inside his chest tightened with regret. The guard remained motionless once again, but the air carried the echo of his stomp. It was a reminder that at any second, that stillness could break into something much louder. Daniel finally took a small step backward, his legs shaky. But the crowd's reaction kept the tension alive. They knew this wasn't over yet. The guard had not spoken, and everyone wondered if he would. Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket, but the damage was already done. He had crossed the line. The crowd waited, holding their breath, sensing that the real response was about to come. And Daniel, now pale and nervous, realized that his one small step had drawn the attention of everyone around him, including the guard who stood as a living wall of duty. The moment hung in the air, fragile and heavy, as if time itself was waiting for the next move. The silence after the guard's stomp was sharp and heavy. People in the crowd barely moved, afraid that even their voices might disturb the tense moment. Daniel stood frozen in place, his hands pressed against his sides, unsure of what to do next. He had crossed the line, taken the picture, and now every eye was locked on him. The guard didn't move again at first. His tall frame stood rigid, the polished rifle at his side gleaming in the sunlight. For years, tourists had whispered about how unshakable these guards were, how they never reacted to anything. Yet here, before everyone, that silence had already cracked once with a stomp so powerful it had startled both Daniel and the watching crowd. Daniel's chest rose and fell quickly as he tried to calm his breathing. His earlier excitement was gone, replaced by fear. He thought about stepping back behind the rope, pretending nothing had happened. But it felt too late. He had already broken the rule, and the guard was aware of him now. The people watching grew restless. Whispers spread like ripples on water. A middle-aged woman near the front shook her head and muttered, "He shouldn't have done that. They always warn people." A man beside her held up his phone, whispering, "Keep recording. This is going to be serious." Some people frowned in disapproval, while others leaned forward, curious, almost eager to see how the famous guard would react. Suddenly, the guard's voice thundered through the air. "Stand back!" The words were sharp, commanding, and carried with them a weight that silenced the entire square. Many tourists had never heard a royal guard speak before, let alone shout. The power in his voice echoed against the palace walls, making it impossible to ignore. Daniel's body jolted as though the words had struck him physically. His heart pounded so hard he thought the crowd might hear it. The shout wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder that the guards weren't there for show. They were real soldiers trained to protect their ground. Daniel's earlier thought that maybe the guard would ignore him vanished instantly. The crowd reacted with a mix of shock and awe. Some gasped loudly while others covered their mouths in surprise. A young boy clutched his father's arm, whispering, "He talked." The guard actually talked. The father nodded, his expression serious, and whispered back, "That's because the man broke the rule. The guards never joke about their duty." Daniel's face turned pale. He had wanted attention, but not like this. Now hundreds of strangers were staring at him. Some with judgment, some with sympathy, and many with phones raised to capture every second. He glanced back at his friend, whose wide eyes and frantic hand signals urged him to return immediately. For a brief second, Daniel thought of trying to laugh it off, maybe wave at the crowd as if it had all been a harmless joke. But the memory of the guard's voice, deep and commanding, kept him still. His legs felt heavy, his pride wounded, and his excitement had completely vanished. The guard did not speak again. He returned to his silent, immovable posture, yet the air around him remained charged with authority. It was clear the warning had been final. Daniel finally took a step back toward the rope, his movements slow, almost hesitant, like someone who had been caught red-handed. The crowd murmured, relieved that he was moving away, but the tension didn't fully lift. Some people in the front rows clapped softly, not out of joy, but out of respect for the guard's discipline. Others shook their heads at Daniel, whispering things he couldn't hear but could easily guess. He knew they were talking about him, about how foolish he had been, about how he had disrespected something sacred. The thought made his cheeks burn with embarrassment. As Daniel returned behind the rope, he realized the guard's reaction had stunned more than just him. The entire atmosphere of the square had shifted. Moments ago, it had been filled with laughter and the playful clicking of cameras. Now it carried a sense of seriousness, a reminder that some traditions demanded respect, no matter how much tourists wanted their perfect pictures. Daniel avoided eye contact with the people nearest him. His phone felt heavy in his pocket. The photo he had taken no longer exciting, but instead embarrassing. He wondered how many of the videos being recorded would end up online, showing him as the tourist who broke the rule and got shouted at by the guard. The idea made him uncomfortable. He hadn't thought about how quickly things could spread on the internet, how one small action could be seen by millions. Yet even in his shame, Daniel couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. The guard's reaction had been so sudden, so powerful, and yet controlled. He hadn't moved aggressively or harshly. He had simply stomped, shouted, and re-established his authority. That single act had reminded everyone present that the line was real, and it was not to be crossed. The crowd slowly returned to its earlier rhythm, though the energy was different now. Parents warned their children not to play near the rope. Couples who had been joking about getting close now stepped back a little farther. The tourists who had been recording stopped only when they felt the moment had passed, though many of them already planned to share the video later. Daniel stood quietly, his friend finally reaching his side. "What were you thinking?" His friend whispered, clearly upset but relieved nothing worse had happened. Daniel shook his head, unable to find the right words. He didn't want to admit that his desire for attention had driven him to ignore the rules. He simply muttered, "I don't know. I thought it would be fine." His friend sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Well, now you know." "You're lucky it didn't get worse," Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. He knew his friend was right. He had been lucky. The guard could have been stricter. The situation could have escalated, and he could have faced far more serious consequences. Instead, he had received a warning. Loud, public, unforgettable. For the rest of the time near the palace, Daniel stayed quiet, blending back into the crowd. But the memory of the guard's voice echoed in his mind over and over, like a lesson carved deep into his thoughts. He had wanted a bold photo, something to impress others. But what he had gotten was an unforgettable reminder of respect, discipline, and tradition. The day moved on, the sun continued to shine, and new groups of tourists arrived. Many of them had no idea what had just happened, but those who had been there would never forget it. They would return home and tell the story of the tourist who crossed the line and the guard whose response stunned everyone. The sound of the guard's command still lingered in the air even after Daniel stepped back behind the rope. People were whispering, some shaking their heads while others replayed the moment in their minds. Many had come that morning expecting to see tradition and ceremony, but what they had witnessed was something far more powerful. The crowd had seen discipline come alive, and it left everyone with a mix of awe and respect. Daniel stood awkwardly beside his friend, trying to disappear into the group. But the truth was he could not hide. Too many people had recorded him. Too many had seen his face. He felt their eyes on him. And though no one spoke directly to him, he could sense the silent judgments. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his shirt collar, wishing he could take back the last 10 minutes. His friend leaned closer and whispered, "You're lucky, Daniel. You don't realize how serious that could have been." Daniel nodded without arguing. For the first time since he arrived at Buckingham Palace, He didn't feel like a tourist enjoying a grand tradition. He felt like someone who had broken a rule written not just on signs but written in history, in respect and in culture. The guard, meanwhile, returned to his position, standing as still as a statue once again. To someone arriving late, it would have seemed as though nothing had happened. His face remained calm, his body motionless, his eyes fixed forward. But those who had been present knew differently. They had seen the silent power hidden behind that stillness. A group of children standing near the front pulled their parents closer, whispering questions in their curious voices. One boy asked his father, "Why did he shout like that?" The father crouched down and replied softly, "Because that's his job. He has to protect this place. The rope is not just a line on the ground, it means respect. When someone crosses it, the guard has to act." The boy nodded slowly, understanding something deeper than just rules. He looked up at the guard again, this time not with playful curiosity but with admiration. The moment had shifted the mood of the entire crowd. Tourists who had been laughing and joking earlier now stood straighter, almost as though they too felt the weight of the tradition they were witnessing. Phones were lowered, voices softened, and everyone seemed more aware of the importance of the palace and those who guarded it. Daniel glanced at his phone, tempted to look again at the picture he had risked so much to take, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. The image, once exciting in his imagination, now felt tainted. He knew that even if the picture was good, it wouldn't show the fear he had felt or the echo of the guard's voice that had left him shaken. It would only be a reminder of his mistake. Around him, the crowd slowly began to shift again. Some people clapped lightly, not in mockery but in recognition of the guard's discipline. It wasn't common to see a guard break their silence, and those who had witnessed it knew they had seen something rare. Others began to talk among themselves, promising to tell their friends and families about the morning when a tourist crossed the line, and the guard's response stunned everyone. Daniel's friend finally spoke louder, enough for Daniel to hear over the chatter. "Look at everyone, Daniel. You think they're impressed by you? No, they're impressed by him. That guard showed more strength in one shout than we could in 100 words. Daniel didn't reply, but the truth of those words stung deeply. The incident had also drawn the attention of other guards posted nearby. They didn't move toward Daniel, but their eyes briefly swept across the crowd, checking for order, reminding everyone that their presence was not ornamental. They were protectors first, symbols second. The crowd's respect grew even deeper. One elderly woman turned to the younger tourists beside her and said with a wise tone, "That is why you never cross the line. Those men aren't here for your entertainment. They're here for their country." Her words carried weight, and the younger ones nodded silently, feeling the lesson settle in their minds. For Daniel, the shame lingered like a heavy shadow. He tried to tell himself it was just a mistake, something he could laugh about later. But inside he knew it was more than that. He had stepped into a space he wasn't meant to, not just physically but symbolically. He had taken lightly something others held in deep respect. Now, with the eyes of strangers still on him, he wished he had simply stayed behind the rope like everyone else. But something unexpected began to happen. A few people who had been recording slowly lowered their phones. Instead of mocking him, they seemed more focused on the guard. The story unfolding in their minds wasn't about a foolish tourist. It was about the silent, powerful discipline of the soldier who protected his ground. In a way, Daniel realized he had become part of a lesson bigger than himself. The square outside Buckingham Palace was alive again, but the mood was forever changed. Where earlier there had been casual playfulness, now there was reverence. People snapped photos again, but they did so from a respectful distance. Children waved from behind the rope, not daring to step closer, and tourists whispered about the moment they had just witnessed, each one knowing it was something they would never forget. Daniel stood still, listening to the hum of conversations around him. He heard words like amazing, unbelievable, and so disciplined repeated again and again. None of them were about him. All the awe belonged to the guard, and oddly Daniel found himself agreeing. He too was impressed, not with his own boldness, but with the strength and composure of the man who had responded without hesitation, without anger, and without losing control. He finally looked up at the guard again. The man stood tall, silent, unshakable. To Daniel, he no longer looked like just a figure in uniform. He looked like a reminder of something deeper. That respect, duty, and tradition carried a strength that no camera could capture. The guard's restraint, his ability to command with just a stomp and a shout, left the biggest impression of all. Daniel realized that the real story people would tell was not about a tourist crossing the line, but about the guard who reminded everyone why the line existed in the first place. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Daniel and his friend walked away quietly. The palace gates grew smaller behind them, but the memory of what had happened stayed vivid. For Daniel, it would be a story he remembered for the rest of his life. Not the story he had intended to create, but one that carried a lesson he would never forget. The moment that began with a foolish step had turned into something larger, something that touched everyone present. The guard had shown that respect was not just a word written on a sign, but a living principle carried out with discipline and dignity. And in doing so, he had stunned not only Daniel but every soul who had gathered that morning by the palace gates. The sun was moving higher in the sky, casting golden light on Buckingham Palace. The crowd near the gates was starting to thin out as tourists wandered off to their next stops, but the memory of what had happened remained fresh in every mind. Some people were still talking about it in hushed voices, replaying the sharp stomp, the booming command, and the stunned reaction of the young tourist. Even as they left, they carried the story with them, ready to tell it again to friends, family, or even strangers when they returned home. Daniel walked slowly down the wide street with his friend beside him. The noise of the crowd faded behind them, but the weight in his chest did not. His friend hadn't said much since they left the palace, giving him space to think. Daniel needed it. His mind kept replaying every second. The moment his foot crossed the rope, the click of the camera, the deafening stomp, and the thunder of the guard's voice. He had thought it would be just another fun memory, but instead it had become a lesson carved deep into his heart. For the first time since he had arrived in London, Daniel didn't feel like a tourist chasing pictures. He felt like someone who had been taught something important. The royal guard's response had been firm but measured. The man hadn't humiliated him, hadn't mocked him, hadn't gone further than what was needed. He had simply done his duty with precision and strength, showing the world that some traditions are far more than tourist attractions. Daniel's friend finally broke the silence. "You know, that was a moment you'll never forget." His tone was calm, not angry anymore. "It's not the picture you took that matters now. It's what you felt, and I think deep down you know why it matters." Daniel nodded, staring at the ground as he walked. "Yeah," he whispered. "I thought it would just be a joke, just for fun. But now I understand. I disrespected something that deserves respect." His friend gave him a small smile. "Exactly. And think about it. You didn't just learn it for yourself. Everyone there learned it too. You became part of a story that people will tell for years. Not because of you, but because of that guard and the way he stood his ground." Those words made Daniel lift his head. He realized his friend was right. The story wasn't really about him. It was about the guard. Daniel was only the spark that revealed the strength behind the tradition. And maybe that was the lesson he needed most. Later that evening, when Daniel returned to his hotel, he sat on the edge of his bed and finally opened his phone. The photo he had taken was still there, frozen in pixels. Himself with the tall guard just behind him, the palace shining in the background. To anyone else, it might have looked like an impressive picture, but to Daniel it now carried a different meaning. It wasn't proof of bravery. It was proof of a mistake and a reminder of respect. He thought about deleting it, but instead he left it in his gallery. Not to share with others, but to remind himself of what he had learned. The photo would never go online, never be sent to his friends, never be used for attention. It would stay as a quiet reminder that sometimes crossing a line teaches you more than staying behind it. Across the city, meanwhile, people who had recorded the event were already uploading their videos. Within hours, clips of the guard's sharp command began spreading online. Comments flooded in. Admiration for the guard, surprise at his powerful voice, and respect for his ability to control the situation with such discipline. Daniel's face appeared in many of those videos, but he no longer cared. The attention he had once craved now felt meaningless compared to the respect he had gained for the man in uniform. In the following days, Daniel and his friend continued exploring London. They visited museums, parks, and historic landmarks, but no matter where they went, the memory of the palace stayed strongest. It wasn't the photos he took afterward that mattered most. It was the feeling that had been planted deep inside him. a feeling of humility, of respect for something bigger than himself. One afternoon, while sitting by the River Thames, Daniel finally spoke about it again. "You know," he said softly, "I think that guard taught me more than I've learned from any guidebook." His silence, his stomp, his voice, it wasn't just about protecting the palace. It was about teaching respect. His friend nodded. And the best part? He didn't do it with anger. He did it with control. That's real strength. That's why everyone respected him. Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's strange. I thought I would feel embarrassed forever. But now I feel grateful, because I got to see with my own eyes what discipline and duty look like." Back at Buckingham Palace, tourists continued to arrive each day. New crowds gathered, snapping photos, pointing at the guards, whispering about their stillness. But those who had been present that morning would always carry a special memory. They would tell others about how a young tourist crossed the line, and how the guards' response stunned everyone. They would talk about the stomp, the shout, the silence that followed. And in their retelling, they would always emphasize the respect they felt afterward. For Daniel, the story lived on not as a tale of embarrassment, but as a turning point. It became a reminder that respect is not about following rules out of fear, but about recognizing the meaning behind those rules. The rope was not just a boundary, it was a symbol of tradition, history, and honor. And the guard was not just a figure in costume. He was a protector of something sacred. As Daniel prepared to leave London at the end of his trip, he stood once more near the palace gates, this time behind the rope like everyone else. He looked at the guards with a quiet smile, not of mischief but of admiration. He didn't take a photo. He didn't step closer. He simply stood there for a while, watching, remembering, and respecting. The city moved on around him. Buses rolled past. Tourists laughed and pointed, cameras clicked. But inside, Daniel felt a stillness that matched the guards, a stillness filled with understanding. He had crossed a line once, and it had taught him a lesson he would never forget. The story ended not with the picture he had taken, but with the respect he had gained. And in the end, that was the memory that truly mattered.